Thanks for joining, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute or two. Hang in there. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about data privacy and what it means for digital advertising. So to start out, just want to talk about what consumers have been experiencing over the past couple of years. Consumers have been largely unaware of how their data has been collected and stored. And they're often dismayed to find that the amount of information that private companies have on them is more than they expected. And we're talking about demographic information, geographic information, behavioral, purchasing behavior, location tracking, things like that. There have been a lot of well-publicized data breaches out there, including ones from Target, Equifax, eBay, Marriott, and notoriously Ashley Madison. A couple years ago, you may have seen this movie, The Great Hack, which came out on Netflix in the summer of 2019. That movie did a great job of exploring, what kind of potential there was for companies like Cambridge Analytica to make use of people's personal data to influence people. A lot of this stuff has been very alarming for people, and as a result, you can see some of the stats here that how consumers feel about their personal data and their data privacy. A lot of them feel that companies are very vulnerable to hacks and cyber attacks. Not many of them really trust companies to be responsible with their sensitive data. They just want to make sure that they have more control over their data. So that's why we're talking about data privacy. Data privacy it's not a new concept, but it's definitely gained steam over the past 10 years. It focuses on personally identifiable information, which we often call PII. And how that information is stored and shared with third parties. How do people collect it? And what are people doing about it? There's various regulatory restrictions coming into play, as you all know about, with GDPR and CCPA, et cetera. So there's been a lot of momentum with data privacy initiatives. And you see some of this stuff coming from browsers as they try to limit the amount of tracking that can occur without users understanding what tracking is going on. And it also comes in the form of regulation so that governments can ensure that consumers are aware of what kind of tracking is going on, what kind of data might be stored from them, and have an ability to influence that by opting in or out of certain practices that companies have. So over the last few years, you see many different moves from browsers and government agencies dealing with all this stuff. If we kind of focus in on the browsers, they're really playing a big part in limiting the amount of tracking or collection of identifiable information. As early as 2017, Safari started a project called Intelligent Tracking Prevention. And that was meant to prevent third-party cookies from really having an ability to track people in the browser. And that's used a lot of machine learning techniques, trying to just understand the patterns of these different cookies that are set, and being able to kind of classify which cookies should be blocked and which ones shouldn't. Firefox recently also has come out and said we're just going to block third-party cookies by default. And that had quite a big impact, especially where Firefox usage is high in a lot of European countries. And then Google famously has eliminated or announced the elimination of third-party cookies on Chrome as early as 2022, which really has a lot of people kind of scrambling to figure out what we're going to be able to do about, if we want to be able to track audiences anonymously. There's a little bit of speculation on Google's announcement. Some people have come out and said that, maybe they won't be able to eliminate them in 2022. Others believe that they are, but the industry seems to be moving forward, kind of planning as if that's going to happen. And not only cookies are at stake, cookies are one way of having anonymous identifiers for people. But devices are also another way that IDs are passed around and used to identify people. And Apple's IDFA is sort of the next thing that is sort of at risk here, because they've announced that as of iOS 14, apps are going to have to basically ask permission to be able to use the IDFA to track people. And so it's still sort of TBD to find out what percentage of people are going to opt out of that. And there are some estimates that say 80 to 90% of iOS 14 users could become untargetable if they choose to opt out. So what does that mean for digital marketing? Well, it obviously poses a threat in terms of being able to target users and individual users specifically in the same way. So the industry is kind of suddenly in a panic about all this, and not sure how we can continue to rely on third-party data to be able to target users. What kind of challenges are people going to have specifically? Well, these are four major areas where we expect to have challenges. One of them is just in targeting, which probably gets the most attention. If we can't know who a user is, even anonymously, then how are we going to choose which ads to show those users? Personalization is another area where we might be able to show an ad, but what do we show in the ad? Are we going to have the ability to customize the creative of an ad? And then pacing is another one. If you can't identify someone easily, it's kind of hard to control frequency caps for ads and how often they're going to show to the same person within a given time frame. And then lastly, attribution becomes difficult because if you can't identify somebody, we can't really track when they saw an ad and how many times they saw it, and then when they eventually converted, sort of tie the conversions back to the different ads that they saw. So what are some of the solutions that people are thinking about in terms of moving on after potentially these third-party cookies go away as a result of data privacy concerns? Well, one of them is just more reliance on first-party data. So as you know, first-party cookies, as distinguished from third-party cookies, are not going away, and there's no plans for them to go away. So that means that publishers who have audience visiting their sites directly, they still have the ability to cookie their users and identify them, whether it be anonymously through cookies or through identifiers that are provided by users who log into those publishers' websites. So that's great for publishers. Identity is not so much threatened for a direct publisher. But there's some concern about how can everybody take advantage of that? You know, will people have to do deals directly with individual publishers in order to understand their data well enough to do targeting? What's the more scalable solution for this? Well, the good news is there's a standard from the IAB called the IAB Audience Taxonomy, which, if successful, would allow publishers to start to work within that standard taxonomy so that as they understand their users and the different audience segments according to that taxonomy, they can create these taxonomy identifiers and pass them up in a supply chain so that on the buy side, there's some consistency amongst all the different publishers that are adhering to that taxonomy. So that could become very important. You know, some of the downside of this is that, you know, with limited scale or publishers that really have valuable data, you know, there could be more premium pricing in place, and it's kind of harder to buy across the open market. The other risk here is that if publishers don't adopt these taxonomies, then you end up with a different language being spoken on every publisher site, and that lack of the implementation of these standards will make it more fragmented and harder to buy at scale. Another direction that people are heading right now is in the area of shared IDs. Shared IDs, this is not a new concept. Obviously, the concept existed even before we were worried about cookies going away. There were organizations like Digitrust that kind of hoped to have multiple players in the ecosystem use shared anonymous identifiers so that we wouldn't all have to cookie sync with each other, and we could recognize people for who they are. Without cookies, there's still a value in shared IDs. It's just that the IDs are probably going to come from more of a first-party relationships from publishers, or potentially from single sign-on solutions that may emerge. The thought there is that instead of signing on to each publisher independently, if people could rally around a common framework for single sign-on, where you would sign into this central service before accessing a publisher's website, then that makes it easier for that sign-on ID to be spread around the ecosystem and used to identify people. So on one hand, it would be great because an ID that comes from somebody authenticating would be cross-device, it would be deterministic. You would know that it really identifies a person, whereas compared to, you know, with cookies, you know, cookies only live a certain amount of time. They're different on every browser. It wasn't quite as good as having a shared authenticated credential. But you have to keep in mind, if there are solutions that emerge like this, there has to be a way for consumers to be able to control what information is shared and be able to easily understand the trade-off they're making of providing something like an identifier in exchange to access information. And consumers have to easily be able to opt out of that. That will, if successful, enable a lot of use cases that I mentioned earlier as being threatened. For example, targeting and personalization, and even multi-touch attribution. The downside here is that we still don't really know, even if such a solution exists, how many consumers will find it worthwhile to log in and potentially offer up a personal piece of data, such as an email address or a phone number, as an identifier for the industry to be able to use to attach data to them. So the downside is that, you know, maybe this won't scale well, maybe it won't reach masses of people. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Google Sandbox proposals. This is another emerging effort here by Google to provide some alternatives to not having cookies. And the way this works is, you know, the Chrome browser would essentially show people something similar to a CAPTCHA to basically obtain a trust token to identify that this is a real user, and then use that in conjunction with various browser APIs that Google would make available in the Chrome browser. And you know, these APIs are they're varied in terms of what they can do. So One of them is called federated learning of cohorts, or FLoC. This is to use on-device machine learning to try to understand people's browsing behavior so that the browser itself can bucket people into groups that could be used for interest-based advertising. So this kind of takes the place at what third-party data companies used to do and put it all in the browser itself and controlled by Google. It actually uses some clever machine learning and privacy maintaining machine learning techniques such as federated learning, which means that the data that's used to train these algorithms, they never get sent to any third-party companies. They all remain within the browser. And while that happens, a shared update to the different machine learning models can be still pushed out to the different browsers. So it's a very interesting technology. For things like remarketing, Google has exposed or is talking about an API which used to be called Pigeon, which stood for private interest groups, including noise, and is now been replaced with another one called Turtle Dove, which stands for two uncorrelated requests, then locally executed decision on victory. So you can see they're getting creative with the names here, and there seems to be some type of a bird theme going on, which kind of is interesting. Anyway, these APIs, like I mentioned, the key thing about them is that they're all within the browser. And since the data remains in the browser, people's personal identifying information never leaves the browser and never gets to any of these third-party companies. There's also a couple other APIs they're talking about. One is called a privacy budget. The privacy budget is meant to sort of weaken fingerprinting. And as you all know, fingerprinting is the act of finding certain settings and preferences that somebody has set within their browser and looking at what unique combinations of those that there are for each person and using those as a way to identify the person or giving them sort of a fingerprint. So the way to weaken that is to not allow companies to read all these different settings in your browser. And by settings, we could be talking about like, what is the color of your default links on your web page or something like that. With a privacy budget, those who have legitimate reason to read those settings can read a few of them for whatever purpose they're reading them for, but it would stop the companies that are trying to read all of them for fingerprinting purposes. And then they've got APIs for conversion measurement and aggregate reporting to understand what's the reach of an individual ad, or how many people may have finally ended up buying a product or something like that. All of these different technologies are all written up and you can read about them online, but they're all in development and nothing's been finalized. So at this point, it's still a big discussion on how all this might work. So it doesn't exist yet. The thing that worries me is I don't know if even if these things come to fruition, if they'll work outside of Chrome. And we don't know how long Chrome will have the market share that it does. So there's some concern there. And in a way, it kind of limits the different players and the innovation that might occur from companies who are able to access data and use it to target people. A lot of this will just live directly in Chrome. Another big area that can be considered an alternative, or at least something to work in conjunction with whatever emerges, is contextual targeting. And contextual targeting is something near and dear to me and GumGum because it's one of the areas that we focus on and we specialize in. But what's important to understand is that contextual targeting, which is the understanding of the environment that a user is engaging with, this can be used for targeting and as a proxy for audience as well. As an alternative of like looking for somebody who is in market to buy a car based on all the websites they might have visited in the past, you could also use contextual targeting to determine, well, right at this moment, somebody is looking at a web page that is comparing different cars, and they might be an auto intender as a result of that. It's interesting because, in the marketplace, contextual targeting can often be less expensive than behavioral targeting. And even as an imperfect proxy to audience, it can be more cost effective sometimes to use contextual targeting as an audience proxy. And GumGum actually released a white paper recently that dives into how that's the case. But talking about contextual targeting, how it works, you know, one of the ways that it's worked in the past is simply by looking at the text on a web page that a user is visiting and kind of pulling out keywords, and then using groups of keywords to either block or target content that an ad would show up on. What's really emerging and what GumGum focuses on goes beyond keywords and uses machine learning techniques, and specifically supervised machine learning techniques, to understand content. So what that means is we obtain thousands of labeled web pages or images or videos where a human has to look at those pages and say, what type of category does that page or image or video fit into, and train a computer algorithm to understand how to make predictions about future content that it encounters based on all the training from human labeled data. So I think that's sort of like the latest and greatest in contextual targeting. And it leverages neural networks and deep learning, which are algorithms that are very well suited for what we call unstructured data. And unstructured data is anything that you can't really represent easily in a spreadsheet. For example, the text on a page or the pixels in an image. So harnessing all the latest technology to do that, algorithms are able to go quite further than they used to in recognizing subtleties of content and what the meaning of them are. You can avoid the common trap of mistaking like the meaning of a keyword. For example, shoot, which might be applied to guns, but it also might be applied to or used by content talking about people playing basketball or people shooting photographs. Those sort of nuances with keywords can largely be overcome using machine learning from contextual targeting. So I've gone through a lot of different sort of alternatives and how the industry might deal with the situation of cookies going away as a result of consumer concerns over data privacy. I guess the question is, like, what do we think is going to happen next? And one of the things that is likely is that there's sort of an advantage for walled gardens. We're talking big publishers like Google and Facebook and other big publishers, as they have a sizable relationship with users and access to first-party data for large groups of people. So they can kind of go on largely unaffected. And also there might be a lot of sort of attention turned towards TV networks and TV buying if the struggles with sort of open market buying for display and video on the web continue to be a challenge as a result of cookies going away. As I mentioned, I think contextual targeting is a great alternative and complement to any other audience targeting that you're using, because contextual really doesn't use any personal identifiable information at all. It only looks at the digital environment a user is interacting with. Where I think the jury's still out and where we sort of have a ways to go and trying to see how things play out are with smaller publishers who might not want to enable sign-ins on their websites, and app developers who might be threatened by some of the recent changes with, for example, IDFA or other device identifiers that might come after it. And then how all of these kind of fit into the open market. Just the ability to have these identifiers part of every bid request that goes to every DSP could be threatened. So that's sort of the general outlook and my thoughts on where things are going with respect to cookies and identity and data privacy. So thank you. That concludes sort of the content portion. We do have a QA portion. So if you guys are haven't noticed, there's an ability to submit questions and answers in the Zoom here. And we're going to kind of go through some of the questions that we've received. And Gina is going to join me to read the questions.
Hey there. Yeah, so we did get a bunch of questions. So we'll try to get through most of these as we go. But if you have questions and we don't get to them, feel free to submit through contextual advertising at gumgum.com and we'll try to get back to you with answers on those in the next couple of days. So again, contextual advertising at gumgum.com if we don't get to the questions, and feel free to put questions in the QA box here as well while we're kind of going through this. Great. So first question. So this one is two parts. Are industry organizations attempting to build or coordinate any of their own solutions? And if so, are they likely to be adopted as standard?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of a number of industry organizations that are spending a lot of time on the situation. One that I follow most closely is the IAB Tech Labs Project ReArc. So they have working groups, focused on the business aspects of these things, accountability and addressability, and are trying to really discuss all the issues at play here and come up with kind of guiding principles and standards that the industry can use to both honor data privacy concerns in consumers and make sure that consumers have control over their data, while also allowing some ability for consumers to allow companies to get some of that information to use for targeting and other reasons. So, if you're interested in kind of seeing the latest of where things are headed, I recommend maybe getting involved in some of those groups, or at least following the materials that they're putting out there. One important thing about those groups, though, is they're not trying to build technology or any sort of like hosted solutions. They're really just trying to lay down the groundwork for any solutions that come and what principles they must follow and specs they must follow. That would make sense for everyone. Another announcement that came about recently was from the Trade Desk. They announced something called Universal ID 2.0, which is essentially a kind of a concrete hosted solution that would speak to one of the slides I was talking about earlier with shared IDs and universally identifying people. And so that would be an emerging concrete implementation that would that's expected to adhere to some of the work that's being done by the IAB. And is kind of an open solution. Even though the Trade Desk proposed it, they're inviting participation from companies throughout the ecosystem to be collaborative in not only using it, but in sort of its development. And then another group that I heard about most recently is called Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media, or PRAM. This one is talking about kind of broadening the swath of different participants into these conversations to go beyond, some of the ad tech companies and really branch more into getting the trade bodies involved and the different brands and agencies and publishers to join the technology firms in this conversation and kind of where things go. So, what's likely to be adopted? I don't know if I could predict, but I do see some momentum with that Trade Desk solution and the stuff coming out of Project ReArc.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like there's obviously a lot of people working on this in different places. So this next question is sort of in that same vein. Are there interim solutions or hacks on hand? And if so, how long are those likely to work? So somebody trying to game the system in the meantime.
Well, I think the hacks, probably refer to just the ability to continue to track people with anonymous identifiers, even though there's a lot of momentum against doing that in the first place, right? So that's kind of why they're hacks, because, I think we all have to face the reality that eventually it's the will of the consumers that we don't do this, right? But some people have put in hacks, and to get specific, like there are companies that have tried to use DNS tricks where, it makes it look like a third-party company is actually a first-party company to a user by getting a publisher involved in redirecting the domain name of the publisher to a service provided by a third party. So that's one sort of trick that people have used. I think there's also been some companies that have tried to launch like window shades, which are like little notices that come up at the bottom of a browser.
Mhm.
And if they can get a user to click on that window shade for whatever reason, they're trying to establish a first party relationship with that user. And that can go to a certain extent on making your cookies last longer, that type of thing. But again, those types of things are getting sort of blocked gradually by the browsers, specifically by Safari's intelligent tracking prevention system. That as they get more sophisticated, they're able to kind of catch the different things that people are doing to try to ultimately block those things. There's also some activity with companies doing identity graphs, trying to group anonymous third-party identifiers and kind of represent one individual person. I think that will continue, but eventually they'll have to be moving towards making those graphs based on more kind of first and second party data once users are accustomed to logging into content.
Okay, so do we see these changes and these concerns as likely to raise publisher CPMs, and will we still be able to target open exchanges, which seem like separate questions, but
yeah, I mean, I think the CPM for a user that has provided a piece of personal data that can be used for targeting, I think can potentially be higher than the CPMs now, because there should be more confidence that you know who that user is, because that identifier is following them around the industry and across publishers and ad tech providers and stuff. So it could potentially, I would say, raise CPMs, but the question is like, at what scale? If the opt-in rates for users on this type of thing are lower, then these high CPMs would only exist for like a smaller group of people. So I think that's kind of like one interesting thing to wait for, is to just find out, once a lot of these solutions emerge, is what are the participation and opt-in rates? How many users are going to understand this quid pro quo about supplying that information for free content, and how many will just opt out of it completely? It's kind of yet to be seen.
Okay, and then moving on. So I guess, I mean, you kind of answered this, but I think, the large concern is that as an industry, will we just have to revert to a more primitive targeting and attribution methods, or do you see something emerging to sort of rival what we're using now and get that same kind of data?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on the success rate of things like Project Rearc and these other solutions. If they're successful and people do understand the trade-offs, and they do decide to log in to access free content, and it does scale, then potentially everything gets better, not more primitive. Like frequency capping and targeting and attribution, they all become better. But even if they don't, I mean, some of the other options that we talked about today as alternatives, they're not really more primitive. In fact, I would even say they've become more sophisticated, rather than more primitive. Like the stuff that is in the Google Privacy Sandbox using federated machine learning, that's some of the most sophisticated technology that's out there right now. The type of neural networks used for contextual targeting, again, cutting edge technology. It's not primitive at all. It might be an improvement on a technique that was considered primitive in the past, but the future has a lot of opportunity for less primitive solutions.
Awesome. And moving on, and this is the last question I think that we have so far, what role will AI play in all of this?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple things. I mean, like if talking about AI, it probably is really focusing more on sort of machine learning, which is kind of a subset of AI. And machine learning is used heavily in a lot of different areas. Like it's used in Safari's intelligent tracking prevention algorithms. It's heavily used in the federated learning of cohorts algorithm that was mentioned for the Google Privacy Sandbox. It's heavily used in neural networks that are doing contextual targeting, as I mentioned, deep learning. So AI is not going to is never going away. It's going to be used more and more and more in every single place that data exists. I think pretty soon you'll just expect AI to be everywhere.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of change to come, but a lot of things to look forward to as well in the next, couple of months to see how this all plays out. That was the last question that we had, so we will wrap things up. But if anything else does come up, again, contextual advertising at gumgum.com. Feel free to submit questions and we will answer them there.
Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining.